Welcome to the Midnight Archives. Sit back, relax, and let history take you somewhere far away. July the 8th, 1947. The front page of the Roswell Daily Record ran a headline that morning that no American newspaper had ever run before, and that no American newspaper, in all the years that followed, would quite manage to run again with the same combination of confidence and complete wrongness. The headline said, RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. The story beneath it reported, with the matter-of-fact tone of a paper accustomed to covering agricultural fairs and local politics and the occasional cattle dispute, that the intelligence office of the 509th Bombardment Group of the United States Army Air Forces had announced the capture of a flying disc, that the disc had been recovered from a ranch in the general vicinity of Roswell, New Mexico, and that it was being forwarded to higher headquarters. The story was short. It did not speculate extensively about what the disc was or where it had come from. It reported what the Army Air Forces had said, which was that they had found something and left the question of what that something was to the imagination of the reader. The imagination of the American reader in the summer of 1947 was well prepared for exactly this kind of story. The previous 2 years had seen the end of the most destructive war in human history, the development and use of weapons of a power that previous generations would have considered beyond the capacity of human technology, and the beginning of a confrontation with the Soviet Union that promised, not metaphorically but literally, the potential extinction of human civilization. The world had revealed itself, in the span of a few years, to be capable of things that had previously existed only in science fiction. If atomic bombs were real, if rockets that could reach across continents were real, if guided missiles that could navigate to their targets without human hands on the controls were real, then the question of whether disc-shaped aircraft from somewhere other than Earth were real did not seem, in the summer of 1947, entirely unreasonable to ask. The Army Air Forces retracted the story the same day. By the afternoon of July the 8th, the official explanation had changed. What had been recovered on the ranch near Roswell was not a flying disc, but a weather balloon of a particular type, used for atmospheric research, made of rubber and aluminum foil and balsa wood sticks, the kind of thing that floated up into the upper atmosphere and came down when the rubber degraded or the wind changed. The rancher who had found the debris on his property, a man named Mac Brazel, who had been puzzled enough by what he found to drive into Roswell and report it to the sheriff, had simply found a weather balloon that had come apart on landing. There was nothing remarkable about it. The story was over. The story was not over. It would not be over for the next 75 years and counting, because the retraction, coming on the same day as the original announcement, replacing one official explanation with another in a matter of hours, delivered with the slightly too smooth efficiency of an institution that has realized it has said something it should not have said and is moving quickly to unsay it, had the precise opposite of its intended effect. Instead of closing the story, the retraction opened it. It gave the story the one thing that transforms a newspaper item into a legend, the suggestion that what is being officially denied is exactly what actually happened. This is where the mythology of Area 51 begins, not in the desert of southern Nevada, not in the classified programs of the Central Intelligence Agency, not in the flights of the aircraft whose existence the United States government would spend the next 4 decades denying, but in the specific quality of official denial that the American national security apparatus had been forced, by the peculiar circumstances of the early Cold War, to perfect. The denial that sounds like a denial, the explanation that explains too smoothly, the retraction that arrives too quickly. These were the instruments by which the government of the United States, in the years between 1947 and the end of the Cold War, attempted to keep its most important secrets. And they were, in an irony that the people who deployed them would not have appreciated, the instruments by which those secrets became the most fertile ground in American history for the growth of stories about things that were not true. But before the mythology, there was the reality. And the reality was, in its own way, stranger and more interesting than the mythology it eventually produced. The reality begins not in Roswell and not in Nevada, but in the specific crisis of the early Cold War, in the situation that confronted the United States government in the years immediately following the end of the Second World War, When it became clear that the alliance with the Soviet Union that had won the war was not going to survive the peace, and that the Soviet Union was an adversary of a kind that the United States had never previously faced, a continental power of enormous size and population, possessed of a conventional military of the largest scale, developing nuclear weapons with a speed that American intelligence had not anticipated, and governed by a system that was, from the American perspective, opaque in a way that no previous major adversary had been. The opacity was the central problem. The United States knew, by the early 1950s, that the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. They had tested their first device in August of 1949, years earlier than American intelligence had predicted. They knew that the Soviet Union was developing long-range bombers capable of reaching the continental United States. They knew, or strongly suspected, that the Soviet Union was developing intercontinental ballistic missiles that would eventually make the bomber question irrelevant. What they did not know, could not know with any confidence using the intelligence-gathering methods that were available to them at the time, was the scale, the pace, and the specific capabilities of the Soviet military buildup. They did not know how many bombers the Soviets had. They did not know where the missile test sites were. They did not know how advanced the Soviet nuclear program had become in the years since the first test. They were, in the most important strategic sense, flying blind. The consequences of flying blind in the nuclear age were potentially civilizational. If the Soviet Union achieved a decisive advantage in nuclear weapons and delivery systems, if they reached a point where they could destroy American cities and American military installations before American forces could respond, the deterrence that was supposed to prevent nuclear war would fail. The United States needed to know what the Soviets were doing, and they needed to know it with a specificity and a currency that the available intelligence methods could not provide. The available methods were, by the standards of what would later become possible, primitive. Human intelligence, spies, informants, defectors, could provide some information, but the Soviet security apparatus was efficient and brutal, and operating human agents inside Soviet territory was difficult and dangerous, and produced information that was fragmentary and often unverifiable. Signals intelligence, the interception and analysis of Soviet communications, was useful, but limited by the fact that the most sensitive Soviet programs were conducted with security measures that made their communications difficult to intercept and harder to interpret. Aerial reconnaissance, the photographing of Soviet territory from aircraft, was the most promising method, but it depended on having aircraft that could fly over Soviet territory without being shot down, and the aircraft available in the early 1950s could not do this. Soviet air defenses, while not as sophisticated as they would later become, were capable of reaching the altitudes at which conventional reconnaissance aircraft flew. What was needed was an aircraft that could fly higher than Soviet air defenses could reach, high enough that it was effectively invulnerable to interception, able to cross Soviet territory at will, photograph whatever it flew over, and return safely to base with intelligence that no other method could produce. The aircraft did not exist. It needed to be built. The program to build it was called, with the bureaucratic creativity typical of the organizations that ran it, Project Aquatone. The aircraft it produced was designated the U-2. The place where it was designed, built, tested, and first flown was a dry lake bed in the southern Nevada desert, approximately 80 miles north of Las Vegas, in a region of the Nevada test site that had been used for nuclear weapons testing, and that was, for this reason, already classified, already restricted, already surrounded by the kind of official prohibition that kept civilians away. The place had a name on the maps of Groom Lake, after the body of water, more correctly a body of dried mud and salt flat, that occupied its center. But the people who worked there called it, after the administrative designation on the restricted area maps, Area 51. The decision to build the reconnaissance aircraft program at Groom Lake was made in the spring of 1955 by a group of men whose names were not, at the time, publicly associated with the program and would not be for decades. The decision was made by Richard Bissell, the CIA officer who managed the program, in consultation with Kelly Johnson, the chief engineer at the Lockheed Skunk Works, the classified advanced development division of the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation that had built some of the most capable military aircraft of the Second World War, and that would, over the following decades, build several of the most remarkable aircraft ever flown. Johnson had proposed the basic design of the U-2 in a submission to the Air Force and the CIA in the previous year, and had been selected to build it after a competitive evaluation that considered several other designs. He needed a place to build and test it that was remote enough to prevent observation, large enough to provide adequate runway space, and already classified enough that the additional security required for a program of this sensitivity could be implemented without attracting attention. Groom Lake met all of these requirements. It was a dry lake bed of approximately 3 miles in length and 2 miles in width, flat and hard-packed enough to serve as a runway without construction, surrounded by mountains on 3 sides that provided visual screening from the surrounding desert, located within the boundaries of a restricted area that was already patrolled and monitored, and distant enough from population centers that the aircraft testing that would be conducted there would not be observed by civilians under normal circumstances. Johnson flew over it in a small plane in the spring of 1955 and pronounced it suitable. Construction began almost immediately. The men who built the facility at Groom Lake and who would work there in the years that followed were a specific kind of American, the kind produced by the particular combination of technical education, patriotic commitment, and taste for secrecy that the Cold War national security apparatus attracted and rewarded. They were engineers, mostly, and pilots, and the various categories of support personnel that a functioning aircraft testing program requires: mechanics and fuel handlers, and communications technicians and security guards and cooks, and the various other people without whom a remote desert installation cannot sustain itself. They came from California and Texas and the Midwest, from the universities and the military services, and the defense contractors that were, in the 1950s, the institutional infrastructure of American military power. They signed security agreements of extraordinary strictness. They were told, in terms that left no room for ambiguity, that what they did at Groom Lake was not to be discussed with anyone who did not have specific clearance for the program, not with their wives, not with their parents, not with their friends, not with anyone at all outside the program itself. Many of them honored these agreements for the rest of their lives. Some of them died without ever having told their families what they had spent their careers doing. This was not unusual in the culture of the Cold War national security apparatus. It was in fact the norm, the expected behavior of people who understood that the work they were doing was important enough that the discomfort of personal secrecy was a reasonable price to pay for it. The U-2 itself was by any measure a remarkable machine. Kelly Johnson and his team at the Skunk Works had designed it to fly at altitudes above 70,000 feet, approximately 13 miles above the surface of the Earth, more than twice the altitude at which commercial airliners flew, and well above the operational ceiling of any aircraft that the Soviet air defense system could deploy against it. At this altitude, the air is so thin that conventional jet engines cannot produce adequate thrust without special fuel and special compressor design, and the aircraft itself must be built with an almost obsessive attention to weight reduction, because every pound of unnecessary weight is a pound that requires more fuel to carry, and more fuel means a heavier aircraft, and a heavier aircraft requires more thrust, and more thrust requires a heavier engine, in a spiral of compromises that the design had to carefully navigate. The U-2 navigated these compromises by being, in its structure, almost fragile. Its wingspan was exceptionally long relative to its fuselage, over 80 feet, giving it a glider-like appearance that reflected its design philosophy of minimizing drag and maximizing lift at extreme altitude. Its wings were so long and so lightly constructed that they flexed visibly in flight, bending upwards several feet at their tips when the aircraft was airborne. Its landing gear was unconventional, a bicycle arrangement with 2 wheels in line along the fuselage centerline and small outrigger wheels at the wingtips that dropped away on takeoff and were replaced by metal skids for landing. The aircraft was powered by a single Pratt & Whitney J57 engine, the same basic power plant used in the B-52 bomber, modified for high-altitude operation and consuming a special low-volatility fuel, designated JP7, that was formulated to resist ignition at the low atmospheric pressures of the stratosphere. Flying it was, by the accounts of the men who did so, an experience unlike any other in aviation. The cockpit was small and cramped, designed for function rather than comfort, equipped with instruments and controls whose layout had been optimized for the single pilot who would be alone in it for missions of 8 or 10 or 12 hours, crossing thousands of miles of territory that included, at various points, some of the most heavily defended airspace in the world. The pilot wore a partial pressure suit, a garment that applied mechanical pressure to the body to compensate for the near vacuum of the upper stratosphere. That was uncomfortable and restrictive, but necessary for survival at altitudes where an unpressurized human body would lose consciousness within seconds. The oxygen system was sensitive and the pressure suit was hot, and the cockpit was dark and the aircraft was difficult to fly, demanding continuous attention and precise control inputs to maintain the narrow band of airspeed that was, at extreme altitude, the difference between efficient cruise and aerodynamic stall. The pilots who flew the U-2 were selected from the best available pool of military aviators, primarily Air Force fighter pilots with exceptional records and the particular combination of physical fitness, psychological stability, and flying ability that the program required. They were recruited through a process that was itself classified, approached by men they did not know, and asked questions whose purpose they did not initially understand. Invited to volunteer for a program whose nature they were not told until they had agreed to it. Those who agreed and were selected were resigned from the Air Force, technically on paper, and became civilian employees of the CIA, a status change that provided a legal fig leaf separating the program from direct military involvement, and that also meant that if one of them was shot down over Soviet territory, the United States government could, in principle, deny that the pilot was a military officer acting under military orders. This was, as several of the pilots would later observe, a somewhat theoretical comfort. If you were shot down over the Soviet Union at 70,000 feet in an aircraft that was definitively not a Soviet aircraft, the question of whether you were technically a civilian employee of a government agency or a military officer operating under orders was unlikely to be the first thing on your mind. The first U-2 flights over the continental United States, conducted from Groom Lake in the summer and fall of 1955, produced the first of the UFO reports that would, over the following decade, accumulate into a pattern significant enough to eventually attract official attention and require official response. The U-2 cruised at altitudes between 60 and 70,000 feet, altitudes that placed it well above the maximum ceiling of any commercial aircraft and most military aircraft of the period, and at which it was, for practical purposes, invisible from the ground. What was not invisible was the aircraft's contrail, the condensation trail of ice crystals that jet aircraft leave behind them in the cold air of the upper atmosphere, and the sunlight that reflected off the aircraft's polished aluminum skin. At ground level, in the early morning or late evening when the sun was low on the horizon, an observer looking up at the sky might see, if the atmospheric conditions were right and their eye happened to fall on the right part of the sky, a small bright point of light moving at high altitude in a straight line, leaving a thin white trail behind it. The point of light was the U-2, catching the sunlight at an angle that made it visible at altitude, even when the ground below was in shadow or twilight. The commercial airline pilots who reported these sightings to the Civil Aeronautics Authority, and several dozen of them did, in the years between 1955 and 1960, described what they saw in the terms available to them: a bright object moving fast, at extremely high altitude, following a straight course, not behaving like any aircraft they were familiar with. They were, in this description, accurate. The U-2 was not behaving like any aircraft they were familiar with, because it was an aircraft of a kind that did not officially exist, operating at altitudes that no aircraft they knew of could reach, and belonging to a program whose existence was among the most closely guarded secrets in the American national security apparatus. The reports went to Project Blue Book. Project Blue Book was the Air Force's official program for the investigation and explanation of unidentified flying object reports. It had been established in 1952, succeeding two earlier programs, Project Sign and Project Grudge, that had been set up in the late 1940s to investigate the wave of flying saucer reports that had begun with the Roswell incident and had continued, with varying intensity, through the early years of the Cold War. Blue Book's official mandate was to determine whether UFO reports represented a threat to national security and to reduce public concern about the phenomenon by providing rational explanations for the reports that came in. The rational explanations were, in most cases, genuinely rational. Misidentified conventional aircraft, weather balloons, atmospheric phenomena, astronomical objects observed under unusual conditions, the various optical effects that can make ordinary things look extraordinary when seen against an empty sky. The Blue Book investigators were, for the most part, serious and professional, and the great majority of the reports they investigated had explanations that, when the full circumstances were known, were entirely mundane. But there was a category of reports that the Blue Book investigators could not explain, not because the phenomena described in those reports were genuinely inexplicable, but because the explanation was classified. The U-2 reports fell into this category. When a commercial pilot reported seeing a bright object at extreme altitude, moving fast and straight and not behaving like any known aircraft, the Blue Book investigators knew, or could know if they had the appropriate clearances, exactly what the object was. It was a U-2. The explanation was simple and complete and entirely satisfying from the standpoint of scientific inquiry. But it was also classified at a level that prevented it from being included in the Blue Book case files, which were themselves classified, but at a lower level. The U-2 program was compartmentalized. Access to it was restricted not just by classification level, but by specific need-to-know designations that meant that even people with high general clearances did not have access to U-2 information unless they had a specific operational reason for it. The Blue Book investigators, whose job was to explain UFO reports, did not, for most of the program's history, have the clearances necessary to access the explanation for a significant fraction of the UFO reports they were supposed to explain. The result was that these reports were listed in the Blue Book files as unidentified. Not because they were genuinely unidentified, the people who ran the U-2 program knew exactly what they were, but because the people who were supposed to identify them had been, by the architecture of the classification system, deliberately prevented from doing so. This was not, from the perspective of the CIA and the Air Force, an entirely undesirable outcome. The alternative to having commercial pilots report unidentified objects that turned out to be the U-2 was having them report identified objects that turned out to be the U-2, which would have required either explaining what the U-2 was, thereby compromising the program, or lying in a way that was likely to be detected and that would create worse problems than the UFO reports themselves. The ambiguity of the unidentified category was, in this sense, useful. It allowed the government to neither confirm nor deny the existence of the program by the simple expedient of not having the people responsible for explaining UFO reports be in a position to explain these particular reports. Whether this outcome was deliberately engineered from the beginning, whether someone at the CIA or the Air Force made a conscious decision to use the UFO mythology as cover for the reconnaissance program, is a question that the historical record does not fully answer. What the record does show is that as the U-2 program matured and the number of reports attributable to it accumulated, the relationship between the classified reconnaissance program and the public UFO phenomenon became a matter of deliberate policy consideration at the highest levels of the relevant agencies. The consideration of this policy took place as so many important considerations in the American national security apparatus took place, in documents whose full contents were not declassified for decades and whose existence was not publicly acknowledged until well after the events they described had receded into history. But those documents, when they were eventually released, told a story that was considerably more interesting than either the official position, there are no flying saucers, or the counter-mythology, the government is hiding alien spacecraft, had suggested. The story they told was this, that the government of the United States, in the 1950s and 60s, found itself in the position of needing to keep one of its most important secrets by allowing, and in some cases, actively encouraging, the public to believe something that was not true. The something that was not true was that the unidentified objects being reported by pilots and civilians across the country were of extraterrestrial origin. The something that was true was that many of them were American reconnaissance aircraft, operating at altitudes and speeds that the public did not know were possible, on missions whose existence the government could not acknowledge without compromising programs on which the security of the country, in the government's judgment, depended. This was the bargain. The price of keeping the real secret was allowing the false story to circulate uncorrected, and the false story, as false stories do when they circulate uncorrected in a culture that is primed to receive them, grew. The culture that was primed to receive the flying saucer story in the 1950s was not, it should be said, an irrational culture. It was a culture that had, in the preceding decade, been given excellent reasons to believe that the world was capable of things that previous generations would have considered impossible. The atomic bomb was impossible until it was real. The rocket was impossible until it was real. The jet aircraft, the radar, the electronic computer, the antibiotic, all of these were, within the living memory of people who were adults in the 1950s, things that had not existed and then had suddenly existed, transforming the conditions of life and war in ways that were still being absorbed. The question of whether extraterrestrial intelligence existed and whether its representatives might have built aircraft capable of reaching Earth was, in this context, a question that a reasonable person could ask without being irrational. The evidence for flying saucers was thin, but the evidence against them was not much thicker, and the general principle that things previously thought impossible turn out to be possible had been so thoroughly demonstrated in recent decades that skepticism about any particular impossibility was harder to maintain than it had previously been. Into this receptive culture, the events of the summer of 1947 dropped like a stone into water, and the ripples spread. The Roswell incident was the first and largest ripple, but it was not the only one. In the years between 1947 and 1952, hundreds of sightings were reported across the United States and around the world. Bright objects in the sky, disc-shaped craft, lights that moved in ways that conventional aircraft did not move, objects that appeared and disappeared without explanation. Some of these were the products of misidentification: weather balloons, conventional aircraft seen at unusual angles, atmospheric phenomena. Hoaxes, the ordinary visual errors that human perception is prone to under conditions of uncertainty and expectation. Some were the products of the specific anxiety of the early Cold War, in which the sky had become, for the first time in American history, a potential avenue of attack from a foreign power, and in which any unidentified object in the sky carried, however irrationally, a freight of threat. And some were the U-2. The men who flew the U-2 from Groom Lake in those early years were aware, in a general way, of the UFO phenomenon and of the relationship between their flights and the sightings that commercial pilots and civilians reported. They were not, for obvious reasons, in a position to do anything about this awareness. They could not correct the record, could not explain to the curious public or the credulous press that the bright object seen at extreme altitude moving fast and straight was not an alien spacecraft but a Lockheed aircraft with a single J-57 engine and a pilot in a partial pressure suit thinking about when he was going to get to eat lunch. They flew their missions and came back and debriefed and went to their quarters and did not talk about what they had done, and the reports accumulated in the Blue Book files as unexplained, and the mythology grew. What was it like in those years to be one of the people who knew the secret? The men who flew the U-2 from Groom Lake in the late 1950s described, in the interviews and memoirs that began to appear after the program was partially declassified in the 1990s, an experience that was defined by two qualities that existed in permanent tension with each other: pride and isolation. The pride was straightforward. They were flying aircraft that no one else in the world could fly, at altitudes that no one else in the world could reach, on missions of genuine strategic importance to the security of their country. They were, by any reasonable measure, doing extraordinary things, and they knew it, and the knowledge was satisfying in the way that doing difficult and important work is satisfying. The isolation was more complicated. They could not tell anyone what they did. Their families knew that they worked in aviation, and that their work was classified, and that they spent time away from home at a location they could not identify. But beyond this general outline, the specifics were absent. The wife who asked where her husband had been for the past 2 weeks received an answer that was technically true and entirely uninformative. The friend who asked what kind of flying he was doing received the same. The social world of a man with an extraordinary secret is, of necessity, a world in which a large portion of what he knows and does and thinks about is unavailable as the subject of ordinary conversation. And the people who lived in this world for years developed, by most accounts, a particular quality of self-containment, a habit of keeping their own counsel, of being comfortable with the presence of information that could not be shared, of living with the knowledge that the things they were most proud of were the things they were least able to talk about. The base at Groom Lake in those years was a specific and peculiar place. It had been built quickly and without the amenity of a permanent military installation. The original facilities were temporary structures, prefabricated buildings of the kind that went up fast and were not designed for comfort or longevity, arranged on the hard-packed mud of the lake bed in the practical configuration of an operational facility rather than a planned community. There was a runway, obviously, the essential infrastructure of any aviation facility, and hangars for the aircraft and maintenance shops and fuel storage, and the communications equipment necessary to manage the flights. There were barracks for the people who lived there, and a mess hall, and a recreation room of the sort that remote installations provide to keep their personnel sane during the periods between work. There was a small hospital and an administration building, and the various other structures that accumulate around any human enterprise of sufficient complexity and duration. What there was not in those years was anything that suggested permanence or official acknowledgement. The base at Groom Lake did not appear on public maps. It was not listed in the directories of military installations. It had no official name, at least none that was used in any document that might be seen by people without appropriate clearances. The workers who arrived there by bus from Las Vegas, a weekly trip, the men picked up at a nondescript location and transported to the base without being told exactly where they were going, though after enough trips the geography became apparent, were entering a place that, in the official geography of the United States government, did not exist. The not existing was, of course, itself a kind of existence. A place that officially does not exist still has a physical location, still has people in it, still has aircraft flying from it that can be seen from the ground at appropriate distances and altitudes. The not existing was a legal and administrative fiction maintained by the classification system and the security protocols and the signed agreements of the people who worked there, and it was a fiction that could be sustained as long as those people honoured their agreements, and as long as the aircraft that flew from the base did not attract attention in ways that required official explanation. The aircraft attracted attention. The U-2 was not, in the terms of the aviation community that observed it from the ground, a discrete aircraft. Its contrail at extreme altitude was visible under the right atmospheric conditions for distances of 100 miles or more. Its glider-like silhouette, glimpsed occasionally by observers with good binoculars who happened to be in the right place at the right time, was unlike anything in the public inventory of American military aviation, and its performance characteristics, the extreme altitude, the long duration, the specific sound of its engine heard occasionally near the base during takeoffs and landings, were, to anyone who knew what they were listening for, distinctive enough to suggest that whatever was operating from that dry lake bed was not a conventional military aircraft. The people who noticed were, for the most part, the people who lived and worked in the sparsely populated desert communities of southern Nevada, the ranch hands and miners and small-town residents whose daily lives took them outdoors in the wide open spaces where an aircraft at extreme altitude was simply more visible than it was in the crowded airspace of a metropolitan area. They reported what they saw to the people they reported things to, local law enforcement in some cases, or the newspapers, or simply their neighbours, and the reports added to the accumulating body of sightings that fed the UFO mythology. The ranchers and miners of southern Nevada were not, by and large, credulous people. They were people who spent their lives in a demanding physical environment and had developed, as a matter of practical necessity, a habit of accurate observation and skeptical interpretation of what they observed. When they said they had seen something unusual, they generally had seen something unusual. The question was what it was, and the answer, a classified reconnaissance aircraft operating from a classified base, was an answer they were not in a position to access. What they got instead, when they asked the question, was silence. The official position of the United States government on sightings of unidentified aerial phenomena was, in the 1950s, a position designed to neither confirm nor deny the existence of specific programs, while providing enough of an official response to prevent the perception that the government was ignoring the question entirely. Project Blue Book served this function. It provided an institutional locus for the investigation of UFO reports, gave the impression that the government was taking the question seriously, and produced explanations that were, for the great majority of cases, genuinely accurate. For the cases that it could not explain, the U-2 cases and the cases involving other classified aircraft that were tested from Groom Lake in later years, it produced silence, or the classification of unidentified, which was in practical terms the same thing. The silence was, in the specific and peculiar logic of the Cold War security apparatus, a form of communication. It communicated that there was something being concealed. It did not communicate what was being concealed, and it was designed not to. But the communication of concealment in the context of a public that was already primed by the Roswell incident and the subsequent decade of UFO reports to believe that the government was hiding something about flying saucers was received as confirmation of that belief. The silence about the U-2 was interpreted by the people who believed in flying saucers as evidence of flying saucers. The classified aircraft became, through the alchemy of official denial, an alien spacecraft. This was the mechanism. This was how it worked. Not through deliberate deception, though there was deliberate deception, and not through conspiracy in the dramatic sense of the word, but through the ordinary operation of a security system that was doing exactly what security systems are designed to do in a public environment that was interpreting its operations through the lens of a mythology that the security system's own behavior had helped to create. The first U-2 overflight of the Soviet Union took place on July 4th, 1956. The date was chosen by the people who made these choices with the specific awareness that it was American Independence Day, which was a coincidence that appealed to a certain kind of institutional humor. The flight was made by a pilot named Harvey Stockman, who flew from a base in West Germany rather than from Groom Lake. The U-2 program had, by mid-1956, expanded beyond its Nevada origins to include operational bases in Europe and Asia, from which missions over Soviet territory could be flown, and who crossed the border into East Germany and then Poland, and then into the Soviet Union proper, flying at approximately 70,000 feet over the cities of Minsk and Leningrad and the military installations in between, before turning and flying back out over Poland and East Germany, and landing in West Germany with 8 hours and 45 minutes of flight time and several thousand feet of exposed film. The Soviets knew the flight had happened. Their radar had tracked it. Their air defense controllers had seen it on their screens and had scrambled interceptors that could not reach it, and had watched it cross their territory and depart. They knew it was an American aircraft. There was no other possibility, and they knew they could not shoot it down. What they could not do, without publicly acknowledging that American aircraft were overflying Soviet territory with impunity, was protest it through official channels. To protest it officially would be to admit that American reconnaissance aircraft had demonstrated a capability that the Soviet air defense system could not counter, which would be humiliating in ways that the Soviet leadership of 1956, less than 3 years after the death of Stalin, the leadership still consolidating its position and uncertain of its domestic standing, was not prepared to accept. So they said nothing, and the flights continued. In the 4 years between the first overflight in July of 1956 and the shoot-down of Francis Gary Powers in May of 1960, the U-2 flew over the Soviet Union approximately 24 times, photographing military airfields and missile test sites and naval installations and the various other targets that American intelligence needed to understand in order to accurately assess Soviet military capabilities. The intelligence produced by these flights was, by the accounts of the people who analyzed it, transformative. It provided, for the first time, a reliable factual basis for assessments of Soviet military strength that had previously been based on estimates and extrapolations and the fragmentary information that human intelligence could produce. Among the most important things it showed was what the Soviets did not have. American military and intelligence planners in the late 1950s had been operating on estimates of Soviet bomber and missile strength that were, in several important respects, significantly inflated. The estimate of Soviet long-range bomber strength, the so-called bomber gap, had suggested that the Soviet Union was producing large numbers of strategic bombers at a rate that would soon give them a decisive advantage over American forces. The U-2 photography showed that the actual number of Soviet strategic bombers was considerably smaller than the estimate had suggested, that the production rate was lower, and that the bomber gap, in the specific form in which it had been argued, did not exist. This was important intelligence. It was also, in the specific political context of the late 1950s, uncomfortable intelligence. It suggested that the defense spending justified by the bomber gap estimate was based on inflated threat assessments, and it created pressure for reassessment of programs and budgets and force structures that had been built around those assessments. The intelligence was used, and its use produced genuine improvements in the accuracy of American strategic planning, but its use was also complicated by the political implications of what it showed, and the complication added another layer of classification and compartmentation to a program that was already among the most closely held secrets in the American government. Back at Groom Lake, the program continued to expand. The U-2 was not the only aircraft tested there in those years. The facility that had been built to support the U-2 program had acquired, by the late 1950s, the infrastructure and the security protocols and the culture of secrecy that made it the natural location for other programs that required remote testing facilities and high levels of security. The CIA and the Air Force used it for aircraft development programs whose existence could not be publicly acknowledged, and the range of exotic and advanced aircraft that flew from the Groom Lake runway in the years that followed made it, within the small community of people who knew about it, one of the most remarkable places in American aviation history. The people who worked there in those years, and the people who flew from there, carried with them a particular awareness of what they were part of. They were operating at the leading edge of American technical capability, in a place that did not officially exist, doing work that could not be discussed, flying aircraft that the rest of the world did not know existed. The combination of technical excitement and enforced secrecy and the specific quality of living inside a secret produced, in the culture of Groom Lake, something that the people who were part of it later described in terms that suggested a kind of institutional pride distinct from any other kind of professional pride. The pride of knowing something important that almost no one else knew, of being trusted with something that the country depended on, of doing work whose importance could not be acknowledged and whose difficulty could not be appreciated by anyone who was not doing it. Outside the perimeter of Groom Lake, the mythology continued to grow. The sightings continued. The reports accumulated in the Blue Book files. The press covered the UFO phenomenon with varying degrees of seriousness and varying degrees of accuracy, and the public consumed the coverage with an appetite that showed no sign of diminishing. Books about flying saucers appeared and sold well. Organizations devoted to the investigation of UFO reports were formed. The question of whether the government was hiding information about extraterrestrial visitors became a staple of the specific genre of American popular culture, part paranoia, part wonder, part the particular pleasure of believing that the official version of events is concealing something more interesting, that the Cold War had produced, and that would outlast the Cold War by decades. The officials who managed the programs at Groom Lake watched this with a mixture of amusement and calculation. The amusement was the ordinary amusement of people who know the answer to a question that everyone else is asking, and who cannot share the answer. The calculation was more serious. The UFO mythology, however inaccurate in its specific claims, was serving a function. It was absorbing the public's curiosity about what was happening in the Nevada desert, and redirecting that curiosity toward an explanation, alien spacecraft, that was, in the crucial sense, wrong about the specific thing that needed to be kept secret. The people who saw something unusual in the sky above the Nevada desert and concluded that it was of extraterrestrial origin were, in their conclusion, mistaken. But their mistake was a mistake that the national security apparatus could live with, and in some cases actively preferred to the alternative. The alternative was the truth, that the unusual thing in the sky was an American reconnaissance aircraft of extraordinary capability, operating from a classified installation in the Nevada desert as part of a program whose existence, if publicly acknowledged, would compromise ongoing intelligence operations and create diplomatic complications with both allies and adversaries. This was the truth that needed to be kept, and the flying saucer story, however false, was keeping it. This was the bargain at the heart of the Area 51 mythology. Not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, not a roomful of men deciding to deceive the American public about alien spacecraft, but something stranger and more interesting, a situation in which the most effective way to protect a real secret was to allow a false story to circulate uncorrected, because the false story was drawing attention away from the real one, and because correcting the false story would require revealing the real one, and revealing the real one was not an option. The bargain held for 4 years after the first overflight. It held through 24 missions over Soviet territory. It held through the accumulating body of UFO reports that were, in significant part, attributable to U-2 operations. It held through the political controversies over bomber gaps and missile gaps, and the appropriate level of American defense spending. It held, in short, until the morning of the 1st of May 1960, when a U-2 piloted by a civilian CIA contract employee named Francis Gary Powers was hit by a Soviet surface-to-air missile at altitude over the city of Sverdlovsk in the central Ural Mountains and came down. The bargain, when it ended completely and in public, in a way that exposed not just the U-2 program but the full architecture of official denial that had sustained it for 4 years, the Blue Book cases filed as unidentified, the weather balloon explanations, the careful official silence about what was flying over the Nevada desert and what it was doing over the Soviet Union. The Powers incident cracked the wall, and through the crack came everything. The truth about the aircraft, the truth about the missions, the truth about the relationship between the classified programs and the UFO reports that had accumulated through the 1950s. It came out slowly, and not all at once, and not completely even then. But it came out enough to establish, for anyone paying close attention, the basic outlines of what had happened. That the government had been running secret aircraft programs of extraordinary capability from a classified facility in the Nevada desert, that those programs had been responsible for a significant fraction of the UFO sightings of the 1950s, and that the official response to those sightings had been shaped, at least in part, by the need to protect the programs rather than by the need to inform the public. The people who believed in flying saucers received this information and, for the most part, did not find it convincing. They had invested too much in the extraterrestrial explanation to abandon it easily, and the partial disclosure of the U-2 program answered some questions while raising others. If the government had been concealing the U-2 for 4 years, what else was it concealing? If some of the UFO reports were explained by classified aircraft, could all of them be? The machinery of official concealment, having been partially exposed, did not thereby lose its power to generate suspicion. It merely redirected that suspicion toward new objects. And, in the Nevada desert, at the base that did not officially exist, on the dry lake bed whose name had not yet become a cultural shorthand for everything that the government was assumed to be hiding, the work continued. There were other aircraft, there were other programs, there were other secrets whose existence required other concealments, other official silences, other explanations that were technically accurate and substantively misleading. The apparatus of classification and denial that had been built around the U-2 was not dismantled when the U-2 was exposed. It was repurposed, redirected toward the next generation of aircraft, and the next generation of programs, and the next generation of secrets that the Cold War required. The base at Groom Lake continued to expand. The runway was lengthened. New hangars were built. The population of the facility grew as new programs required new personnel, and the security perimeter was extended and reinforced as the sensitivity of what was being done inside it increased. The place that had been built in 1955 as a temporary facility for testing a single aircraft had become, by the early 1960s, a permanent installation of considerable size and complexity, dedicated to the development and testing of aircraft, so advanced and so secret that no other facility in the country had the combination of remoteness, security, and technical infrastructure to support them. And outside its perimeter, the mythology continued to grow. The sightings continued, the reports accumulated. The explanations that could be given were given, and the explanations that could not be given were not given, and the gap between what was explained and what was not was filled, as it had always been filled, with the stories that people tell when official explanations are inadequate or absent. The stories were about aliens, the truth was about aircraft, but the truth was classified, and the stories were not, and the stories therefore spread in ways that the truth could not. through the culture and the press and the particular American appetite for the idea that the official version of events is concealing something more interesting. The stories became books and films and television programs, and eventually the specific cultural institution of Area 51, the name that had been a bureaucratic designation on a restricted area map, meaning nothing more than the 51st of a series of numbered areas within the Nevada test site, had become a synonym for the secret itself, for the whole architecture of things the government was not telling the public, for the gap between what was officially acknowledged and what was really happening in the desert of southern Nevada. That gap was real, but its contents were not what the mythology said they were. In the restricted airspace above Groom Lake, in the pale morning light of a Nevada spring, an aircraft was on its takeoff roll, its long wings flexing as the speed built, the lakebed surface blurring beneath it, the mountains on the horizon still in shadow. The aircraft climbed steeply, its engine note changing as it rose through the first 1,000 feet, the second, the third, climbing toward the altitude where the air thinned to almost nothing, and the sky above turned from pale blue to the deep blue-black of the stratosphere, where it would cruise for 8 or 10 or 12 hours before descending back to the dry lake bed that was not on any public map, landing on the hard mud of a place that officially did not exist, carrying in its cameras the photographs that would tell the people who needed to know what was really happening in the parts of the world that they could not otherwise see. Below, on the ground, someone who had gotten up early enough, or who happened to be in the right place at the right moment, might have caught a glimpse of something in the high sky, a glint of reflected sun, a thin contrail already dispersing in the stratospheric wind, a point of light moving fast and straight and at an altitude that no aircraft they knew of could reach. They would have watched it and wondered, and perhaps written down what they had seen, and the report would have joined the others in the accumulating file of things that the people who knew the explanation could not explain. The light moved across the sky and disappeared over the mountains, and the desert was quiet again, and the secret held. Below, on the ground, someone who had gotten up early enough, or who happened to be in the right place at the right moment, might have caught a glimpse of something in the high sky, a glint of reflected sun, a thin contrail already dispersing in the stratospheric wind, a point of light moving fast and straight and at an altitude that no aircraft they knew of could reach. They would have watched it, and wondered, and perhaps written down what they had seen, and the report would have joined the others in the accumulating file of things that the people who knew the explanation could not explain. The light moved across the sky and disappeared over the mountains, and the desert was quiet again, and the secret held, for now. The aircraft that followed the U-2 at Groom Lake was called the A-12, and it was in almost every measurable respect more extreme than the aircraft it was designed to replace. Where the U-2 had been built for altitude, for operating above the reach of Soviet interceptors and missiles by flying higher than they could go, the A-12 was built for speed. It was designed to cruise at Mach 3.2, which is approximately 2,400 miles per hour, or about 3.5 times the speed of sound, at an altitude of between 75,000 and 90,000 feet. At this speed and altitude, the aircraft was, in the straightforward physical sense, unreachable. No interceptor aircraft of the early 1960s could get close to it, and no surface-to-air missile system then in existence could be aimed with sufficient precision at something moving that fast to have a reasonable probability of hitting it. The A-12 was developed under a program called Oxcart, which was managed by the CIA in the same way that the U-2 program had been managed, secretly, with contractors and personnel operating undercover, with the facility at Groom Lake serving as the primary development and testing site. The design came again from Kelly Johnson and the Lockheed Skunk Works, but the engineering problems that the A-12's performance requirements created were of a different order of magnitude from those that the U-2 had presented. Flying at Mach 3.2 subjects, an aircraft to aerodynamic heating. The friction of the air against the airframe at that speed generates temperatures that would destroy most materials. The leading edges of the A-12's wings, at cruise speed, reach temperatures of around 600 degrees Fahrenheit. The skin of the aircraft, across most of its surface, operated at temperatures that aluminum, the standard material of aircraft construction, could not tolerate. The solution that Johnson and his team developed was to build the A-12 primarily from titanium, a metal that is both lighter and stronger than steel, and that can withstand the temperatures of sustained high-speed flight. Titanium, in the early 1960s, was not a material that the American aerospace industry had extensive experience working with. It was difficult to machine, difficult to weld, temperamental in its behavior under the stresses of fabrication, and available in large quantities primarily from one source, the Soviet Union, which had extensive titanium deposits and was the world's leading producer of the metal. The CIA, building an aircraft designed to overfly and photograph the Soviet Union, was purchasing the primary material from which it was built, from that same Soviet Union, through a series of intermediary companies that obscured the ultimate destination of the purchases. Whether the Soviets knew what their titanium was being used for is a question that the available records do not definitively answer. The A-12 first flew at Groom Lake on April 26, 1962. The pilot was Louis Schalk, a Lockheed test pilot who had been at the Skunk Works for several years and who had been selected for the Oxcart program with the same criteria that had governed the selection of the U-2 pilots. Technical skill, psychological stability, the capacity for the sustained secrecy that the program required. The first flight was brief and unofficial. Schalk took the aircraft up to see how it handled before the formal first flight that was scheduled for the following day, and it revealed the characteristic that would define the A-12's testing phase. The aircraft was extraordinarily difficult to fly, more demanding than anything that had previously existed, a machine that rewarded precision and punished every deviation from it, with consequences that were, at the speeds and altitudes at which it operated, terminal. The testing continued through 1962 and 63, a period during which the skies above the Nevada desert regularly contained an aircraft that was unlike anything else in the world, faster than anything that had been built, higher than almost anything that had been built, invisible to radar in a way that the U-2 had not been, moving through the stratosphere at a speed that put it beyond the reach of any pursuit. The sightings of unusual aircraft over Nevada continued, and the reports continued, and the explanations continued to not be given. The people in the towns along the roads near the test site, Rachel, Nevada, which sat on State Route 375 a few miles from the northern boundary of the restricted area, and Alamo, and the other small communities of the high desert, were by the early 1960s accustomed to seeing things they could not explain. They had been accustomed to it since the mid-1950s, when the U-2 program had first put unusual aircraft in their sky. The A-12 intensified the experience. It was faster and more dramatic than the U-2, capable of producing a sonic boom that could be heard for miles, and that when it occurred over populated areas, sometimes broke windows and startled livestock, and the booms were officially attributed to natural phenomena or to conventional aircraft operating at high speed, and the attributions were accepted by some people and not by others. The people who did not accept them had been, by the early 1960s, organized into something resembling a community of inquiry. The civilian UFO investigation organizations that had been founded in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, various others, had by this point accumulated years of reports and developed methodologies for collecting and analyzing them, and had produced a body of literature, ranging from serious and careful to credulous and sensational, that documented the phenomenon and proposed explanations for it. The explanations that these organizations proposed were, almost universally, of the extraterrestrial variety. This was not entirely unreasonable, given what they knew, which was that something was in the sky, that the military would not explain it, and that the most parsimonious explanation for something that moved faster and higher than any known aircraft was that it was not a known aircraft. The reasoning was sound. The conclusion was wrong, not because extraterrestrial aircraft were impossible, but because the simpler explanation, classified American aircraft, had been systematically withheld from the analysis. The CIA understood this dynamic. The CIA had, in fact, studied it. In 1953, before the U-2 program had generated its first sightings over Nevada, the agency had commissioned a panel of scientists to review the UFO phenomenon and assess whether it posed any intelligence or national security implications. The panel, known as the Robertson Panel, after its chairman H.P. Robertson, concluded that most UFO reports had conventional explanations, that the phenomenon as a whole did not represent a threat, but that the accumulation of unsolved reports created a potential for public hysteria and for exploitation by hostile powers seeking to confuse American air defense systems with spurious reports. The Robertson panel's recommendation was to debunk, to undertake a systematic public education effort that would explain UFO sightings in conventional terms and reduce the credibility of the organizations that collected and promoted them. This recommendation was not fully implemented, partly because the CIA's ability to conduct domestic public opinion programs was limited by its charter and by the political constraints that governed what the agency could do within the United States, and partly because the debunking effort would inevitably draw attention to the question of what the government was concealing, which was precisely the question that the concealment was designed to prevent from being asked. The approach that was actually taken was something between debunking and silence, official dismissal of specific claims combined with official refusal to engage with the underlying question, a posture that satisfied no one and that had the specific effect of reinforcing the conviction of the UFO community that official dismissal was itself evidence of concealment. This dynamic, official silence producing public speculation producing official silence, was, by the early 1960s, well established, and both sides of it had developed the habits and the institutions appropriate to their positions. The government had its classification systems and its security oaths and its unmarked aircraft. The UFO community had its investigators and its publications and its conviction that the government was lying, and between them, in the sky above the Nevada desert, the aircraft flew. The SR-71 Blackbird arrived at Groom Lake in the middle years of the 1960s, and it was the A-12's successor in the way that such things are successors in the classified world. Not a replacement for a failed program, but an evolution of a successful one, a more capable aircraft built on the lessons of the program that preceded it. The SR-71 was larger than the A-12 and slightly slower. It cruised at Mach 3.2 rather than the A-12's top speed of Mach 3.35, but it was designed from the outset for operational use by the Air Force rather than the CIA, which meant it was built in larger numbers and operated from more conventional military bases, and it became, over the course of its operational life from the mid-1960s to the 1990s, the most famous of the secret aircraft. Famous because it was eventually acknowledged, because photographs of it were eventually released, because it was, in its sleek black titanium-skinned beauty, an aircraft of extraordinary visual impact that captured the public imagination in a way that the U-2 and the A-12 had not. The SR-71 was also the aircraft that produced, perhaps more than any other, the specific category of UFO sighting, in which the witness described something that moved faster than anything they had previously seen, faster than the eye could track, faster than any aircraft was supposed to be able to go. At Mach 3.2, the SR-71 could cross the continental United States in approximately an hour. It could be in the sky over Nevada and be 200 miles away in the time it took a person on the ground to look away and look back. The reports of objects that appeared and disappeared, that covered vast distances in seconds, that seemed to violate the normal rules of flight, these were, in many cases, SR-71 sightings by people who had no frame of reference for what they were seeing and no official source willing to provide one. The pilots who flew the SR-71 were accustomed to the experience of moving at speeds that their passengers could not comprehend. They told stories, in the decompression conversations of the test pilot community, of flying across Nevada in daylight and watching the landscape shift beneath them at a rate that made the Earth's rotation perceptible, or of descending from cruise altitude and finding that they had overflown their destination by 100 miles before the deceleration was complete. The aircraft they flew was not a piece of engineering so much as a piece of physics made metal, a machine that existed at the precise boundary of what the materials science and aerodynamics of the mid-20th century made possible, and that operated in a regime of speed and altitude where the ordinary rules of aviation had been replaced by a different set of rules entirely. At Groom Lake, the support for these programs required a workforce that grew through the 1960s and 1970s into something considerably larger than the small team that had arrived in the summer of 1955. The facility expanded correspondingly, New hangars, new runways, new housing and support facilities, a fuel depot capable of handling the quantities of JP-7 that the SR-71's engines consumed at cruise speed, a medical facility staffed by personnel cleared for the specific physiological challenges that high-altitude, high-speed flight created. The population of the facility at any given time might be several hundred people, rotating through on schedules that were calibrated to the operational needs of the programs they supported. These people continued to not be able to say where they worked. The secrecy agreements they had signed remained in force. The habit of official non-existence, of being present in a place that could not be named, working on things that could not be described, returning home to families who could not be told the truth, continued to shape the lives of everyone connected to the programs at Groom Lake. The psychological literature on the effects of sustained secrecy on individuals and families is not extensive, because the subjects of such research are, by definition, difficult to study. But what evidence exists suggests that the effects were real and various, that some people managed the condition without apparent difficulty, developing a capacity for compartmentalization that allowed them to move cleanly between their classified and unclassified lives, while others found the sustained performance of normalcy increasingly difficult, and still others arrived at a state of something like resignation, a flattening of the distinction between the secret and the ordinary that made both seem equally distant from any genuine inner life. The workers arrived on Monday mornings on unmarked aircraft from McCarran Airport in Las Vegas, flying on routes that did not appear in any public schedule, to a facility that did not appear on any public map, to do work that could not be described to anyone who was not already doing it. They returned on Thursday or Friday evenings on the same unmarked aircraft, carrying no documents and no photographs and no artifacts of the place they had been, and they went home to their houses in the suburbs of Las Vegas and Burbank and the other cities from which the Groom Lake workforce was drawn, and they said they had been on a work trip, and they unpacked their bags, and had dinner with their families, and watched television, and went to bed. In the morning, they would wake up in their ordinary houses, in their ordinary streets, and the work would be there in their heads, the specific and technical and consuming work of keeping extraordinary machines in the air, and they would hold it in their heads next to the ordinary things, the mortgage, the children's school, the neighbour's dog, and the two worlds would coexist in the way that irreconcilable things coexist when there is no choice but to carry both of them. Some of them eventually talked. Not immediately. The culture of the classified world was not conducive to talking, and the legal and professional consequences of talking were real and substantial. But over the years, as programs were declassified and the aircraft they had worked on became public knowledge, and the secrecy agreements that had governed their working lives were modified or expired, some of the men and women who had spent careers at Groom Lake began to tell their stories. The stories they told were stories of extraordinary engineering and difficult flying, and the particular camaraderie of people doing difficult work together in a remote place, and they were also stories of the cost of secrecy, of the marriages that had suffered, of the friendships that had been truncated, of the accumulated weight of decades of official non-existence. They told their stories in memoirs and in interviews, and in the oral history projects that began to accumulate in the 1990s and 2000s as the Cold War programs were declassified and the need for concealment was replaced by the appetite for history. The stories were, in their specific details, often surprising. The engineering problems that had seemed insoluble and had been solved, the test flights that had gone wrong and had been survived, the moments of genuine terror at the limits of what the aircraft would do, and they were, in their general shape, the stories of people who had been asked to give a significant portion of their ordinary lives to the service of an extraordinary enterprise, and who had done so, and who had emerged from it with something, a pride in the work, a bond with the people who had shared it, that the passage of time had not entirely diminished. The mythology that had been growing outside the fence at Groom Lake since the mid-1950s reached a new intensity in the 1980s, and the reason for the new intensity was a man named Bob Lazar. Lazar appeared in the Las Vegas media in November of 1989, identified only by a pseudonym in his first television interview, and claimed to have worked at a facility he called S4, which he described as located a few miles south of the main Groom Lake complex, built into the side of a mountain, and used for the study and attempted reverse engineering of extraterrestrial spacecraft. He described in specific technical detail that was unusual for UFO claims of the period the propulsion systems of the craft he claimed to have worked on, systems that used a theoretical element he called Element 115, which he said was not present on the periodic table of elements, as it was then known, but whose properties he described in terms that were, if not technically accurate, at least technically fluent. Lazar's claims were investigated extensively in the years following his appearance. The investigations produced results that were mixed in ways that were genuinely difficult to interpret. Some elements of his background were verifiable and were verified. He had worked at the Nevada test site in some capacity. His name appeared in a Las Vegas phone directory associated with a business at the test site. Other elements were not verifiable. The educational credentials he claimed, including degrees from MIT and Caltech, could not be confirmed. The institutions he named either had no record of him or records that were inconsistent with his account. The CIA and the Air Force did not confirm or deny any aspect of Lazar's account, which was consistent with their policy regarding Groom Lake generally, but which the UFO community took as tacit confirmation of its substance. The absence of denial was read as a species of acknowledgement, on the theory that if Lazar's claims were simply false, the government would have no reason not to say so. This theory was not entirely without logic. The government had, over the preceding 3 decades, demonstrated a consistent willingness to allow false theories about Groom Lake to persist rather than correct them with the truth, because the truth was classified, and the false theories, while embarrassing, were preferable to the revelation of what was actually happening. It was not unreasonable to apply the same logic to Lazar's claims. If the government was not denying them, perhaps it was because the denial would require a disclosure that the government preferred not to make. The logic was sound, and its conclusion was wrong. The government was not denying Lazar's claims, not because they were true, but because engaging with them at all required acknowledging the facility, whose existence it was still declining to officially confirm, and the value of the non-confirmation had not yet been exhausted. The silence was not admission. It was the same silence that had allowed the U-2 sightings to generate UFO mythology in the 1950s. Strategic non-engagement, the institutional preference for uncontrolled speculation over controlled disclosure. But Lazar's claims did something that previous UFO reports had not done. They were specific. They were technically detailed. They were delivered by someone who presented himself as a credentialed professional with direct personal experience of the classified programs he was describing. And they arrived in a media environment, the late 1980s, with cable television expanding the range of outlets for unusual stories, and the internet beginning to create the infrastructure for the rapid distribution of niche information. That was considerably more favorable to their propagation than the media environment of the 1950s and 60s had been. The Lazar story spread. It spread through the UFO community and through the broader culture of conspiracy and alternative information that was growing in the American media landscape of the late 1980s and early 90s. It was discussed in magazines and on television programs and eventually on the internet, where it became one of the foundational documents of the Area 51 mythology, as it would be understood from that point forward. The specific, technically detailed claim that the facility at Groom Lake was being used not just for the testing of advanced aircraft, but for the study of extraterrestrial technology. The claim was almost certainly false. The evidence for it was the testimony of a single individual whose credentials were unverifiable, whose account was internally inconsistent in certain respects, and whose motive for making the claims he made was not transparent. The evidence against it was the entire documented history of the facility at Groom Lake, which was a history of extraordinary but entirely human aircraft, designed and built by American engineers for American intelligence agencies, a history that, once it began to be disclosed in the declassified documents and oral histories of the 1990s, provided a complete and internally consistent account of what the facility had been used for and what it had produced, an account that left no room for the study of extraterrestrial spacecraft because the history was full without them. But the evidence was not the point. The reason the Lazar story spread and persisted in the way that it did, and the reason the Area 51 mythology retained its hold on the public imagination long after the specific aircraft programs that had generated it were declassified, was that the story answered a genuine question with a satisfying answer. The question was, what is the government hiding in the Nevada desert? The answer, extraordinary aircraft built by American engineers, was true, but somehow inadequate to the scale of the secrecy that had surrounded it. The alternative answer, extraterrestrial spacecraft, technology from beyond the solar system, contact with intelligences not of this Earth, was false but adequately dramatic, adequately proportional to 30 years of official silence and denial. The gap between the true answer and the sufficiently dramatic answer was the space in which the Area 51 mythology lived, and it lived there comfortably, fed by the genuine secrecy that surrounded the real programs and by the institutional habit of non-engagement that the government had developed over 3 decades of managing questions it preferred not to answer. In 1994, a group of workers at Groom Lake filed a lawsuit against the United States government. They were not former pilots or engineers or intelligence officers disclosing classified programs. They were environmental workers, men who had been employed at the facility in various maintenance and support capacities, and their lawsuit alleged that they had been exposed in the course of their work to toxic materials that had been improperly disposed of at the facility, and that the exposure had caused serious health consequences that they were seeking compensation for. The lawsuit was remarkable for a reason that had nothing to do with its environmental claims. It was remarkable because, in order to file it, the plaintiffs had to name the defendant, had to identify in a public legal document the facility where the exposure had occurred. The facility did not officially exist. It had no official name. It appeared on no public map and in no public record. The government's position, maintained consistently since the mid-1950s, was that there was no such facility. The lawsuit forced the government to choose between acknowledging the facility's existence and allowing the case to proceed, or invoking the state secrets privilege, the legal doctrine that allows the government to withhold information from court proceedings on national security grounds to prevent the case from advancing. The government invoked the state secrets privilege. President Clinton signed a presidential determination exempting the facility from certain environmental reporting requirements that would otherwise have applied, a determination that was itself a form of acknowledgement. One cannot exempt a facility that does not exist from requirements that would otherwise apply to it. The lawsuit did not succeed, but it produced, in the public record, the first official acknowledgement that there was something at Groom Lake that the government was actively working to conceal. The admission was indirect and narrow, but it was there, and the people who had been arguing for decades that the government was concealing something significant in the Nevada desert noted it with satisfaction that did not, in most cases, lead them to revise their theories about what the concealment contained. The CIA's formal acknowledgement of the U-2 program's connection to Groom Lake came in 2 stages. The first was in 1992, when the agency declassified a history of the Oxcart program, the A-12 and its development, that provided the first official confirmation of the facility's location and its use for the testing of secret aircraft. The second was more complete. In 2013, the CIA released a detailed history of the U-2 program that included maps showing the location of the Groom Lake facility and documents describing its construction and operation in the 1950s and 60s. The release was specifically responsive to Freedom of Information Act requests that had been pending for years, and it provided, for the first time, the official version of the story that had been generating speculation and mythology for nearly 6 decades. The history that the documents told was extraordinary on its own terms. The U-2, the A-12, the SR-71, and the various other programs that had been run at Groom Lake were achievements of engineering and organizational capability that required no extraterrestrial augmentation to be remarkable. They were products of the best engineers and pilots and intelligence officers that the United States could field in the 1950s and 60s, working at the absolute boundary of what was technologically possible, producing aircraft and capabilities that were, in their time, genuinely without precedent in human history. The history also told, more quietly, the story of what the secrecy had cost. Not in the classified world. The cost in the classified world was the cost that had been accepted as the price of the work, the security agreements and the separations, and the sustained performance of normalcy. The cost outside the classified world was different, and in some ways more interesting. The cost was a public discourse about the government and its relationship to the truth that had been distorted for 30 years by the systematic removal of information that would have corrected it. The UFO mythology was not a spontaneous product of credulity or irrationality. It was, in significant part, a rational response to a genuine information deficit. The specific information deficit that resulted from the decision to protect the U-2 program by allowing the sightings it generated to be attributed to extraterrestrial aircraft rather than to American ones. The men who made that decision made it for reasons that were, given what they knew and what they were trying to protect, entirely defensible. The U-2 was a genuine intelligence asset of the first importance. Its exposure would have had real consequences for American national security. The decision to allow the UFO mythology to grow rather than correct it was a decision made by people who were weighing one kind of cost, the distortion of public discourse, against another kind of cost, the compromise of a program that was producing information that the United States genuinely needed. They made the decision that seemed right at the time. Perhaps it was right. The U-2 program operated successfully for 4 years before Gary Powers was shot down, and in those 4 years it produced intelligence about the Soviet military that significantly informed American national security policy and that would not have been available by any other means. Whether the cost, the decades of UFO mythology, the erosion of public trust in official explanations, the specific epistemological damage inflicted on a culture that was taught by the sustained practice of official deception to distrust official explanations even when they were true, was proportionate to the benefit is a question that does not have a simple answer. What is certain is that the decision had consequences that extended far beyond the specific program it was designed to protect. Consequences that were still playing out in the culture and the politics of the United States, decades after the program had ended and been declassified and been incorporated into the official history of the Cold War. The habit of suspicion that the government's silence had cultivated did not end when the silence ended. It continued, redirected toward new objects, feeding on new silences and new official denials, sustained by the accumulated memory of the previous decades in which official silence had been, in fact, evidence of concealment. Outside the fence at Groom Lake along State Route 375, now officially designated the extraterrestrial highway by the state of Nevada, which had recognized the economic value of the mythology that surrounded the nearby installation, the nightly traffic of stargazers and UFO enthusiasts and curious tourists continued. They set up their folding chairs on the roadside and pointed their binoculars and their cameras at the sky and watched for the lights that appeared, from time to time, high above the restricted area, moving in ways that the uncleared observer could not explain. The lights were aircraft. They were always aircraft. But the people watching them from the roadside of the extraterrestrial highway did not know this, could not know it without access to information that was not available to them, and the not knowing was, after 60 years of practice, a condition so deeply embedded in the culture of the place that the disclosure of the true explanation had not materially changed it. The signs at the perimeter of the restricted area still said "Warning." The white pickup truck still patrolled the boundary. The cameras and the motion sensors still watched the approaches to the fence line, and inside the fence, in the hangars, and on the runways and in the laboratories of the installation that officially existed now, but still officially said nothing about what it contained. The work went on. The sky above the dry lake bed was very dark and very clear and full of stars. The signs at the perimeter of the restricted area still said "Warning." The white pickup truck still patrolled the boundary. The cameras and the motion sensors still watched the approaches to the fence line, and inside the fence, in the hangars and on the runways, and in the laboratories of the installation that officially existed now, but still officially said nothing about what it contained, the work went on. The sky above the dry lake bed was very dark and very clear and full of stars. On the morning of June the 18th, 2019, a man named Matty Roberts created a Facebook event. He was 21 years old, a college student in California, and he created the event in the way that 21-year-old college students in 2019 created things. Quickly, without extensive planning, more as a joke than as a serious proposal. He called the event Storm Area 51, They Can't Stop All of Us, and he set the date for September the 20th. and he wrote in the description that the plan was to meet at a designated point near the restricted area and rush the base simultaneously, on the theory that the guards would be unable to stop several million people moving at once. The running style he recommended was the Naruto run, a reference to a Japanese animated series in which the characters run with their arms behind them, which Roberts apparently found funny as a mental image applied to people storming a government installation in the Nevada desert. He expected a few hundred people to respond. Within a week, more than 1 million people had clicked attending. Within a month, the number was approaching 2 million. The event had, in the specific way that things go viral on social media, through sharing and commentary, and the particular kind of ironic engagement that the internet had developed as its primary mode of relating to things it found interesting, become one of the most discussed cultural phenomena of the summer of 2019. The Air Force responded with a statement that was itself a minor cultural event. A spokesperson told a reporter that the Air Force was aware of the planned event and strongly discouraged anyone from attempting to access the installation, noting that it was an open training range and that the US Air Force stood ready to defend America and its assets. The phrasing, open training range, defend America and its assets, was the language of official seriousness applied to what was, by any reasonable assessment, a joke, and the application produced the specific kind of humour that results from the collision of institutional gravity with internet levity. Nobody actually stormed Area 51. On September the 20th, several thousand people gathered in the small communities near the installation in Rachel and in Hico, Nevada, which had organized local festivals to take advantage of the attention, and a smaller number made the drive to the actual perimeter of the restricted area, where they stood in the Nevada desert in the September heat and looked at the fence and the warning signs, and were photographed by the security cameras and, in some cases, approached by the white pickup trucks that had been patrolling that perimeter since 1955. A handful of people were arrested for attempting to cross the perimeter. No one was shot. The installation continued its operations undisturbed. The Storm Area 51 event was in its actual outcome nothing. 2 million people had said they were going. 2,000 had shown up, and the installation whose storming had been proposed was entirely unaffected. In its cultural significance, however, it was something more interesting. A demonstration of how thoroughly the mythology of Area 51 had been absorbed into the general culture, to the point where a joke about storming it could generate 2 million responses within weeks, and where the Air Force felt compelled to respond with the full apparatus of official seriousness. The mythology had been built over 60 years. It had been built, in its origins, out of the genuine secrecy of the U-2 program and the decision not to correct the UFO explanations that the program's sightings generated. It had been built further by the A-12 and SR-71 programs, which had generated new sightings and new unexplained phenomena that fed the same explanatory machinery. It had been accelerated by Bob Lazar in 1989, whose specific claims about extraterrestrial technology had given the mythology a technical specificity that made it both more credible to some people and more entertaining as a story to everyone. And it had been sustained through all the decades of its development by the institutional habit of official non-engagement, by the government's preference for allowing the mythology to grow rather than correcting it with information that was classified or inconvenient. By 2019, the mythology was so well established, so thoroughly distributed through the culture, that it no longer needed the secrecy that had originally produced it to sustain itself. The CIA had acknowledged the U-2 program. The Air Force had acknowledged the SR-71. The Oxcart program had been declassified and its history published. The maps showing the location of the Groom Lake facility were publicly available. The archive of the programs that had operated there was substantial and growing, fed by the ongoing declassification of Cold War records and the oral histories of the people who had worked in those programs. The information was out there, available to anyone who wanted to find it. And yet the mythology persisted. It persisted because the disclosure of what Area 51 had been used for, extraordinary aircraft, not extraterrestrial spacecraft, was, for many people, insufficient. The scale of the secrecy seemed to require a secret proportionate to it, and secret aircraft, however extraordinary, felt like an insufficient explanation for 60 years of elaborate and sustained concealment. The gap between the scale of the secrecy and the comparatively mundane reality of what it concealed, aircraft programs, advanced but human, was a gap that the mythology continued to fill. This was the specific legacy of the decision that had been made in the mid-1950s, that the secrecy, once established and sustained, produced expectations about what it must be concealing that the truth could not satisfy. The government had spent 60 years refusing to tell the public what was at Groom Lake, and when it finally told the public, aircraft, testing, the ordinary extraordinary work of Cold War aerospace engineering, the public's response was, in significant part, to decide that the disclosed truth must be covering for something still undisclosed. The habit of suspicion that the secrecy had created was not cured by the disclosure, it was merely redirected. In the summer of 2020, the Pentagon released 3 videos taken by US Navy aircraft that showed, in infrared footage, objects moving through the sky in ways that the pilots who recorded them could not explain. The objects moved in ways that seemed inconsistent with the aerodynamic constraints that govern conventional aircraft. They accelerated and decelerated rapidly. They moved in directions that required the kind of instantaneous changes in velocity that no known aircraft could achieve. They appeared to have no obvious means of propulsion and to produce no visible exhaust. The Pentagon's statement accompanying the release was careful. It confirmed that the videos had been recorded by Navy pilots, confirmed that the objects in them were unidentified, and noted that the videos had been cleared for release, and that the Navy and the broader intelligence community were investigating the phenomena they depicted. The statement did not say that the objects were extraterrestrial. It did not say they were not. It said they were unidentified. The release of the videos was widely covered, and the coverage produced the range of reactions that such things reliably produce. From the measured curiosity of people who noted that unidentified did not mean extraterrestrial, to the conviction of people who had been arguing for decades that the government was concealing evidence of extraterrestrial contact, and who regarded the video release as a step toward the official acknowledgement they had long been predicting, to the skepticism of people who noted that advanced drone technology or classified aircraft could produce the behaviors observed without requiring any extraterrestrial explanation. The truth, as of the time that the videos were released, and in the years of investigation that followed, was genuinely uncertain in a way that the U-2 sightings had not been. The U-2 sightings had a specific and available explanation, classified American aircraft, that the government was concealing for specific and articulable reasons. The Navy videos had no such available explanation. The intelligence community's investigation, which was publicly reported on in congressional hearings in 2021 and 2022, concluded that most of the unexplained aerial phenomena in the government's databases could be attributed to foreign surveillance technology, drones and balloons and other platforms operated by adversary nations, most likely China, but that a residual category of phenomena remained unexplained by any identified technology, domestic or foreign. The category remained small. The phenomena it contained were genuinely unexplained, in the specific sense that the investigation had not produced a confident identification of their source. This was not the same as saying they were extraterrestrial. The absence of an explanation is not the presence of a specific explanation, but it was also not the dismissal that official responses to UFO reports had previously offered. Something was in the sky, at least occasionally, that American investigators could not identify. The people who had been arguing since the 1950s that the government was concealing its knowledge of extraterrestrial phenomena noted this with satisfaction. The people who had been arguing that the UFO mythology was a product of classified aircraft programs and institutional secrecy noted that the category of genuinely unexplained phenomena was small, and that the bulk of the reports were attributable to identified and prosaic causes. Both observations were accurate. They were also, in the context of 60 years of Area 51 mythology, somewhat beside the point. The point, the thing that the story of Area 51 had always been about, was not, at its core, whether there were or were not extraterrestrial spacecraft. It was about what happens when a government decides to keep secrets from the people it governs, and about the specific and durable consequences that follow from that decision. Consequences that outlast the secrets themselves and that reshape in ways that are difficult to reverse the relationship between the governors and the governed. The man named Tony LaVie, who flew the first U-2 test flight at Groom Lake on August 1st, 1955, died in 2005 at the age of 89. He had spent the last decades of his life in the way that test pilots of his generation often spent them, as a figure of some celebrity in the aviation community, invited to air shows and retrospectives and oral history projects, asked to describe what it had been like to fly the aircraft that had helped define the Cold War. He described it in terms that were, for someone who had spent decades prohibited from describing it at all, remarkably forthcoming. The feel of the aircraft at altitude, the black sky and the curved earth, the specific physical sensation of flying at the absolute limit of what the technology and the physics allowed. He said, in one of his later interviews, that the U-2 was the most beautiful aircraft he had ever flown, and that the beauty was not aesthetic, not the sleek lines of the aircraft or the elegance of its design, though he found those things beautiful too, but the beauty of something that was precisely calibrated to its purpose, that did exactly what it was meant to do in the environment for which it was designed, with no excess and no waste. At 70,000 feet in the thin air of the stratosphere, the U-2 was perfect in the way that things are perfect when they are right for their moment, when the requirement and the capability and the conditions are exactly aligned, and the result is something that could not have been otherwise. He had kept the secret for the years that the secret needed to be kept, and then he had told the story when it could be told, and the story he told was the story that the classified documents confirmed: aircraft, not spacecraft. American engineering, not extraterrestrial technology. The work of human hands and human minds, operating at the boundary of what those hands and minds could achieve. The boundary had moved in the decades since the first U-2 flight, in ways that LaVie had not anticipated and could not have anticipated. The technologies that had seemed impossibly advanced in 1955, sustained supersonic cruise, high-altitude reconnaissance, precision photographic systems, had become, by the 21st century, the baseline from which new programs departed. The aircraft that were being developed and tested at Groom Lake in the decades after the Cold War, the programs whose existence was acknowledged in the way that the existence of classified programs is acknowledged, obliquely, through budget documents and congressional testimony and the occasional deliberate leak, were programs of a capability that the engineers of the 1950s and 60s would have found as difficult to imagine as LaVie would have found impossible to describe to someone who had never flown at 70,000 feet. The work continued. It always continued. The boundary moved and the programs moved with it, and the facility at Groom Lake, which had been built as a temporary test site for a single aircraft program, and had grown, over 70 years, into one of the most significant and most secret military installations in the world, continued to serve as the place where the boundary was pushed, in the specific secrecy that boundary pushing requires. The people who drove out to State Route 375 on clear nights and set up their folding chairs and looked up at the sky were looking for something that was, in one sense, not there: the extraterrestrial spacecraft of the mythology, the recovered technology of intelligences from other solar systems. In another sense, what they were looking for was entirely there. Something real in the sky, something that moved in ways that they could not explain, something that the government would not account for. The lights they saw were not aliens, but the lights were real, and they were unexplained, and the habit of seeking an explanation had brought these people out to the desert on clear nights for 60 years, and had not been satisfied by any explanation that was available to them. There is something in this that is worth sitting with, something about the relationship between secrecy and imagination, between what we are told and what we believe, between the official version of the world and the version that grows in the space between the official version and the truth. The official version of Area 51 was, for 60 years, that there was nothing at Area 51, and the imagination of the people who knew that this was false produced, in the space vacated by the absent truth, one of the most durable and widely distributed alternative narratives in American history. The narrative was wrong in its specifics: the spacecraft, the reverse engineering, the alien bodies in cold storage. But it was not wrong in its instinct, which was the instinct that something significant was being hidden, that the scale of the concealment implied a secret of proportionate scale, that official silence in a democratic society is not something that can be sustained indefinitely without generating exactly the kind of speculation that the silence is designed to prevent. The instinct was correct. The secret was real. The scale of the concealment was proportionate to the scale of what was being concealed. Not spacecraft, but programs of extraordinary ambition and consequence. Programs that had shaped the Cold War and informed the decisions of the people responsible for American national security during the most dangerous decades of the 20th century. The concealment was not paranoia or malice. It was the considered judgment of people who believed, with some justification, that the programs they were protecting were important enough to the security of the country to warrant the costs of concealment, including the cost of allowing a mythology to grow that attributed what they were doing to forces from beyond the solar system. The judgment may have been right. The costs were real regardless. The Groom Lake facility exists. It is visible on satellite imagery, and has been for years, a cluster of runways and buildings and infrastructure on the flat surface of the dry lake bed, surrounded by the empty desert of the Nevada Test and Training Range. Its official name is Air Force Flight Test Center Detachment 3. Its unofficial name, the one by which it is known to everyone in the world who has any awareness of it, is Area 51. The people who work there arrive on unmarked aircraft from Las Vegas and depart on the same aircraft at the end of their rotations. The road that connects the facility to the nearest public highway is closed to public access for its entire length. The perimeter is patrolled by security personnel in white pickup trucks, and by sensors and cameras and various other systems whose nature is not publicly specified. The airspace above the facility is restricted to all non-authorized aircraft for a radius of several miles and to an altitude that is not publicly specified. What is being done inside the facility is not publicly known. The classified budget documents that govern its funding describe programs in terms that are deliberately opaque, and the congressional oversight that these programs receive occurs in classified sessions whose contents are not disclosed. The people who work there have signed the same kind of secrecy agreements that the U-2 and A-12 and SR-71 workers signed, and they maintain the same kind of official silence that those workers maintained, with the same effects on the surrounding culture, the continued accumulation of sightings and reports, the continued operation of the civilian investigation communities, the continued vigil of the people with folding chairs on State Route 375. The lights in the sky are probably aircraft. They have always been aircraft. In 60 years of genuine investigation, no physical evidence of extraterrestrial technology has been produced, verified, and publicly disclosed. Not a fragment of material, not a component, not a record. The absence of evidence is not the absence of the thing itself. The evidence for many things that are real is unavailable for reasons that have nothing to do with the thing's unreality. But it is the condition in which the question currently exists, and it is worth noting clearly as a description of where things stand. The question of whether we are alone, whether the universe contains intelligences other than our own, whether some of those intelligences have visited or are visiting the Earth, is a genuine and important question that deserves serious inquiry. The story of Area 51 is not the answer to that question. It is instead a story about a different kind of question, about what governments know and what they tell, about the relationship between secrecy and trust, about the specific and durable damage that sustained official deception inflicts on a society's capacity to distinguish truth from mythology. The damage was done with the best of intentions, by people who believed they were protecting something important. It produced consequences that extended far beyond the programs they were protecting into the general culture of a country that had been taught, by 60 years of practice, to assume that the official version of things was not the true version. The assumption became a habit. The habit became a reflex. The reflex was applied not only to things that were genuinely concealed, but to things that were not, to the point where the distinction between legitimate skepticism and unfounded suspicion became, for many people, difficult to maintain. This is what the CIA wanted you to think about aliens, not because aliens were useful, but because the alternative, the truth, was more useful still to the people who needed it to stay hidden. The aliens were a story. The aircraft were a fact. And the fact, for the years it needed to remain hidden, hid very effectively behind the story. In the Nevada desert, on the road that runs north through the empty valleys toward the restricted boundary, the night is settling in the way that nights settle in the desert, quickly and completely, the light going from the long gold of late afternoon to the blue of early evening to the black of full night in the space of an hour, the stars appearing one by one and then all at once in the sky that the absence of artificial light leaves entirely to them. The people with their folding chairs are there, as they have been for 60 years, looking up. They are looking for something. Most of them know, at some level, that what they are looking for is probably not what they think they are looking for. The spacecraft they imagine are probably not there, but something is there. Something in the restricted airspace above the facility that the signs forbid approach to. Something that moves through the stratospheric dark at speeds and altitudes that they cannot match. Something that the government continues to decline to fully explain. And so they look. The habit of looking, once established, is difficult to break. The habit of directing one's attention toward the sky above the places where important things are happening and where the important things are hidden, and of being willing to sit in the desert in the dark and wait for a glimpse of whatever is up there, whatever it is. The lights come sometimes. They move across the black sky in ways that are, from the ground, impossible to fully interpret, too high for their altitude to be certain, too fast for their speed to be measured, too distant for their nature to be determined. They are lights in the sky above a place where extraordinary things have been done in extraordinary secrecy for 7 decades, and they could be many things, and the people watching them from the folding chairs on the roadside of the extraterrestrial highway understand this and watch anyway. The night deepens. The stars turn overhead in their slow rotation. The desert is quiet in the way it is always quiet, the vast and ancient quiet of a landscape that was here before any of this, before the aircraft and the secrecy and the mythology and the folding chairs and the warning signs, and that will be here, after, patient and indifferent and unchanged. Somewhere above, in the dark, something moves. What it is, only the people inside the fence know, and they are not saying,